I want you to imagine, just for a second, creating this truly monumental piece of propaganda for your boss. And your boss, in this case, is a head of state.
Right.
And your objective is absolute. You need to engineer this visual masterwork that instills this unquestioning, almost biological loyalty to the reigning monarch.
A huge undertaking.
Yeah, exactly. So you spend years meticulously crafting this image. It becomes a total cultural phenomenon, completely dominating the public consciousness. But, history is famously devoid of loyalty.
Oh, yeah. Always.
So 5 years later, the cultural and political tectonic plates just shift completely beneath your feet. A bloody revolution erupts. And that exact same project, the one you painstakingly engineered to glorify an absolute monarch, is instantly co-opted.
Just hijacked, really.
Hijacked, used as the visual anthem for the forces seeking to tear that exact same monarch down. A revolution that ultimately ends with your patron facing the guillotine. And the final, brutal twist in all of this is that you, the artist who literally slept under the monarch's roof, sit in the assembly and vote to send him to his death.
It really remains one of the most striking political inversions in recorded history. We're looking at a scenario where the architect of the old regime's mythology just seamlessly transitions into the high priest of the new republic's propaganda.
Right.
And using the exact same visual vocabulary to justify both sides.
It's mind-blowing. Welcome to this deep dive, by the way. Today, we are immersing ourselves in Jacques-Louis David's colossal 1784 canvas, The Oath of the Horatii, or, Le Serment d'Oise, if we want to be precise.
Yes.
Our sources for this exploration include detailed spatial and geometric analyses of the painting itself, which, by the way, occupies a massive 330 by 425 centimeters of wall space in the Louvre, alongside all these contemporary historical texts, aesthetic critiques, and biographies detailing its seismic cultural impact.
Oh, it's huge.
It's massive. So our mission today is to essentially reverse engineer this painting. We are going to decode the rigid geometric matrix David used to manipulate viewer psychology, unpack the ancient, blood-soaked mythology that serves as its narrative engine, and really untangle the supreme political irony of its creation.
Because, treating this merely as a painting fundamentally misunderstands its function.
Exactly.
It is the undisputed paradigm of neoclassical art, sure, but more importantly, it is a piece of aesthetic engineering. It was this stylistic earthquake designed to visually annihilate the prevailing artistic norms of 18th century France.
Right, which we'll get into.
Yeah, and it inadvertently became the psychological blueprint for the French Revolution.
But physical scale alone forces a physical reaction. It's 10 feet tall by 14 feet wide.
It's huge.
When you stand in the Daru room at the Louvre, you don't just view the Horatii. It engulfs your peripheral vision. It feels less like looking at a framed image and more like peering into this hyper-rational, austere parallel universe.
You're stepping into it.
You really are. But to understand why David deployed this overwhelming scale to basically shock the Parisian elite in 1784, we really have to establish the narrative foundation. We have to rewind over 2 millennia to understand the raw material David was manipulating.
Right. The narrative DNA of this painting originates way back in the year 669 BC. This is during the reign of Tullus Hostilius, the third king of Rome.
Okay.
And the primary historical record for this comes from the Roman historian Titus Livius, or Livy. Now, during this period, Rome is not the sprawling marble-clad empire we typically picture.
No columns and statues everywhere yet.
Exactly, not at all. It is a nascent, highly aggressive city-state. And it's locked in this brutal existential war of attrition with Alba Longa, which is a neighboring city situated in the Alban Hills.
And wars of attrition in antiquity were basically a fast track to mutual annihilation. You are draining your agricultural workforce, depleting your resources, and exposing both cities to outside invasion.
Right.
Like opportunistic neighbors like the Etruscans are just waiting while you bleed each other dry.
Which forces the leadership of both Rome and Alba Longa into a pragmatic, albeit pretty grim, diplomatic corner.
Yeah.
They recognize that a full-scale infantry engagement will leave the victor too decimated to actually hold the conquered territory. So their solution is a highly structured proxy battle.
Okay.
Instead of mass slaughter, 3 champions from Rome will face 3 champions from Alba Longa in a fight to the absolute death.
Wow.
The surviving trio wins the war for their city, and the losing city just accepts total subjugation.
This relies on that ancient concept of representing the macrocosm through the microcosm. The fate of thousands is distilled into the bodies of just a few guys.
Exactly.
But Livy, And later interpreters inject this layer of agonizing psychological complexity into this pragmatic solution. Because the selection of the champions turns a political conflict into an absolute domestic nightmare.
It really does. So Rome selects 3 brothers from the Horatii family. Alba Longa counters with 3 brothers from the Curiatii family. Now, if this were just a mere gladiatorial contest, the narrative would end there. Just 6 guys fighting. But these 2 families form a deeply entangled aristocratic web. They are intimately connected by marriage and betrothal.
This is where the historical account evolves into high tragedy. And this was heavily popularized in 18th century France by the French playwright Pierre Corneille.
Yes.
He dramatized these events in his 1640 play, Horace. And given that the French educated classes basically knew this play by heart, David knew his audience was bringing all this dramatic baggage to the canvas when they looked at it.
Oh, absolutely. They knew all the background.
Right. So Corneille mapped out the emotional devastation perfectly. You have Sabina, a Curiatii woman from Alba Longa, who was already married to one of the Roman Horatii brothers.
Okay.
And you have Camilla, a Roman Horatii woman who was engaged to be married to one of the Curiatii brothers.
The architecture of the tragedy guarantees that the women cannot win. I mean, Sabina is structurally positioned to lose either the man she married or the brothers she grew up with.
It's awful.
And Camilla is fated to lose either her blood relatives or her future husband. It is a narrative engineered to present the ultimate philosophical stress test.
Yes.
It's the absolute collision of public civic duty against private, familial devotion.
The men are thrust into a scenario where patriotism requires them to effectively murder their extended family. And according to the lore, the Horatii brothers accept this burden without a fraction of a second's hesitation.
Right, and Corneille draws a very sharp psychological contrast here. In the play, the Curiatii champions acknowledge the perverse cruelty of the situation.
They're human about it.
Exactly, they lament this cosmic joke of having to slaughter their brothers-in-law. But the Horatii, particularly the eldest brother, are terrifyingly stoic.
Just ice cold.
Completely. They exhibit this icy fanaticism. They view the suppression of their own humanity as the highest form of civic virtue. They march into the battlefield completely detached from the familial reality of their opponents.
Which leads to the climax.
Oh.
The battle commences, and it is a tactical slaughter. 2 of the Roman Horatii are killed almost immediately. Right.
So it's 3 against 1. But the surviving Horatius uses a feint. He sprints away to separate the wounded Curiatii brothers, and then he systematically executes them one by one.
Just picks them off.
Rome wins. He secures the hegemony of his city. But the psychological core of the story isn't the battle itself, is it? It's the aftermath, when the surviving brother returns to Rome.
Yeah, the aftermath is brutal.
Right.
Because he returns dripping in the blood of his sister's fiancé and his wife's brothers. And he expects a hero's welcome.
Right.
He expects the women to subordinate their personal grief to the triumph of the Roman state.
Yeah.
But when he encounters his sister Camilla, she is shattered.
Of course she is.
She curses Rome. She openly weeps for her dead fiancé, completely disregarding the political victory.
Well, yeah, she's acting like a human being who just lost the love of her life. But to her brother, who has entirely internalized the logic of the state, her human grief is indistinguishable from political treason. He views her tears as a direct threat to the ideological purity of his sacrifice. So in this surge of terrifying patriotic fanaticism, he draws his sword and murders his own sister in the street.
Just kills her right there.
Right there. And famously declares that any Roman who mourns an enemy of the state should meet the exact same fate.
So he executes his sister for failing to suppress her empathy. And the chilling coda to this is the resulting trial. He is brought before the people for murder, but his father, the patriarch of the Horatii, steps forward to defend him.
Right.
The father argues that the murder was justified, that the son's absolute allegiance to the state supersedes the life of a daughter who showed weakness, and the son is acquitted.
The state legally validates the suppression of private emotion through lethal force.
It's so dark.
It is a deeply unsettling conclusion. It prioritizes the collective over the individual to an almost pathological degree.
Which brings us to the central paradox of David's painting. Because, I mean, wait. If you were an artist commissioned to paint a scene from this famously brutal story, the logical choice is the climax.
A murder.
Yeah. The brother standing over his sister's body, the father defending the murder. It's inherently cinematic. It's like directing a superhero movie and ending it right before the final boss fight.
Exactly.
And our sources confirm David actually drafted preliminary sketches of that exact post-murder scene. But he abandoned it. He chose to paint a moment that never even occurs in Livy's history or Corneille's play. He painted them just holding swords, taking an oath. Why omit the most dramatic part of the story?
Because depicting the murder would fatally undermine the ideological argument David was constructing.
Okay, how so?
David realized that presenting a brother standing over the bleeding corpse of his sister would evoke visceral revulsion. The viewer would instinctually sympathize with Camilla.
Right, they'd side with the victim.
Exactly. They would view the demands of the state as tyrannical and the brother as a monster. David needed the viewer to revere the concept of public duty, not recoil from its ugly consequences. The climax was, as he put it, too strong. He required a moment of elevated, uncorrupted ideological commitment.
So he had to sanitize the patriotism. It reminds me of the concept of the pregnant moment in classical aesthetics. That idea that the most powerful art doesn't show the violent action itself, but the tension immediately preceding it.
Yes.
It allows the viewer's imagination to do the heavy lifting without alienating them with all the gore.
It is the absolute pinnacle of the pregnant moment. By inventing the oath, David captures the exact second of total, pure commitment. It is the ideological calm before the moral compromise of the actual bloodshed.
Right.
And this philosophical pivot is heavily influenced by Nicolas Poussin, the 17th century master of French classicism. David openly acknowledged this, stating that while he owed the subject matter to Corneille, he owed the painting itself to Poussin. He applied Poussin's rigorous logic and intellectual restraint to a narrative that was otherwise spiraling into domestic horror.
So David engineers this prequel moment to ensure the viewer absorbs the political theory without being distracted by the domestic tragedy. Let's look at how he physically mapped this ideological argument onto the 14-foot canvas, because the visual hierarchy here is intensely deliberate. It essentially reads like text from left to right.
It does. The left third of the canvas is entirely consumed by the three Horatii brothers. Visually, they are the embodiment of the state's kinetic energy. They are frequently described in art historical texts as men of steel. David has painted them with extreme anatomical tension. Their calf muscles are taut, their stances are wide and grounded, and they are leaning forward collectively, unified by a single overriding purpose.
Their posture is so rigid it borders on the mechanical. And they are all offering this severe, straight-armed salute reaching toward the weapons in the center, the Roman salute.
Right. Their arms form an unbroken visual bridge to the center of the composition where the patriarch stands. The elder Horatius is the unyielding anchor of the painting. He holds the three massive swords aloft, demanding the oath. But the most chilling aspect of the father is his face.
The absolute void of emotion.
Yes.
The sources highlight this specifically. I mean, he is actively sending his sons into a meat grinder, knowing full well that they, or the family they're married into, will be butchered. Yet his expression is completely vacant. He looks like he is performing a mundane administrative task.
Exactly. He ceases to be a human father in this moment and becomes the avatar of the Roman state. His lack of emotion is the visual manifestation of the law, impartial, demanding, and structurally incapable of sentimentality.
Wow.
He holds the instruments of violence, and he absorbs the aggressive energy of his sons without flinching.
And then the eye travels to the right side of the canvas, and the visual vocabulary completely collapses. The contrast is almost whiplash-inducing.
The right side is a study in physical and psychological ruin. Here we find the women of the family. Unlike the taut, upward-thrusting energy of the men, the women are succumbing to gravity.
It just looks so heavy.
They're slumped in chairs, leaning against one another, visibly weeping and devastated.
The wardrobe choices here are fascinating because David was famously obsessive about his archaeological research. He wanted the clothing to feel historically authentic, not just like, draped studio fabric.
Right.
You have Camilla, the Horatii sister engaged to the enemy, depicted in the crisp white toga. And slumped heavily against her is Sabina, the Curiatii woman married into the Horatii, painted in a deep, muted brown.
And the color palette itself reinforces that emotional weight. The crisp white against the heavy brown grounds their sorrow, making it feel dense and inescapable. They are physically intertwined in their grief, grieving simultaneously for the men on the left of the canvas and the unseen men of Alba Longa.
But the detail that anchors the right side of the canvas for me isn't even the adult women. It's the figures pushed into the deep shadows in the background.
Ah, yes.
You have a nurse dressed in black, desperately trying to shield two young children from witnessing this fanaticism. The little girl is burying her face in the nurse's robes, completely overwhelmed. The young boy, the boy, is fighting the nurse's hands. He is peering through her fingers.
That background cluster introduces a profound layer of generational implication. The children belong to Sabina and her Horatii husband.
Which means that boy is watching his father and his grandfather prioritize state violence over the survival of his uncles. This kid refusing to look away, it's chilling. It's like he's already being drafted.
Yes.
He is witnessing the exact moment his innocence is traded for state loyalty. It feels like a terrifying piece of psychological conditioning happening in real time. He is being imprinted with the ideology of the oath. He is learning that to be a man of Rome means severing your empathetic ties.
Your interpretation aligns perfectly with the overarching gender dichotomy David is constructing. The painting visually enforces the Enlightenment-era concept of strictly separated spheres.
Right.
The men inhabit the public, civic sphere. They represent the citadel of Republican patriotism, characterized by action, emotional suppression, and physical rigidity. The women are sequestered in the domestic sphere. They are permitted to express the tenderness, fear, and human grief that the men are fundamentally required to amputate from their own psyches.
Wow.
The nurse and the children act as the connective tissue, illustrating the human cost that the men are so actively ignoring.
He is painting a gendered architecture of state power.
Yeah.
The men uphold the state. The women bear the emotional cost. And what is truly staggering is how David encodes this sociological argument directly into the underlying geometry of the painting. It's not just implied through posture, it is mathematically hardwired into the canvas.
The structural matrix of the Horatii is arguably its most revolutionary feature. The entire 14-foot expanse is governed by relentless, uncompromising adherence to the number 3.
It functions like an algorithmic base code. 3 brothers on the left, 3 swords in the center, 3 prominent women on the right.
And framing them all, dominating the background, is a massive arcade consisting of exactly 3 unadorned stone arches.
Those arches are fascinating. They aren't ornate Corinthian columns dripping with carved leaves. They are thick, severe, almost brutalist Tuscan columns holding up heavy stone. They look like the infrastructure of an aqueduct or a vault.
The austerity of the architecture is entirely deliberate. The arches serve as physical boundaries, isolating the 3 distinct psychological zones of the painting.
Yep.
The left arch visually traps the brothers in their aggression. The center arch elevates the father and the weapons. The right arch confines the grieving women. This method of using architectural elements to segregate narrative beats within a single frame is a direct intellectual inheritance from Renaissance masters.
Right, our sources point to artists like Giotto and Perugino. Perugino, in his frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, used classical architecture to rigorously organize the chaotic throngs of figures. David is reaching back past the frivolous art of his own era to tap into the monumental stability of the Renaissance.
By utilizing that specific architectural framing, David signals to the historically literate viewer that this isn't just a scene. It is a foundational, unshakable truth built with the same mathematical certainty as a Renaissance cathedral.
And the geometry dictating the figures themselves is even more explicit. I mean, if we trace the silhouettes of the characters, the gender divide becomes a literal exercise in linear contrast.
Yeah.
He didn't just paint a scene, he engineered a machine.
Exactly. If you map the contours of the men, the brothers, and the father, you find almost exclusively straight, uncompromising lines.
Right.
Their extended legs, the sharp angles of their locked elbows, the rigid verticality of their torsos, the straight blades of the swords. They are constructed with the visual vocabulary of load-bearing pillars. They project absolute structural integrity.
If the men are load-bearing pillars of the state, they literally have to be painted straight. Whereas the women are allowed to collapse under the emotional weight, they are entirely devoid of straight lines.
Not at all.
They are composed of collapsing arcs, soft curves, and descending diagonals. The swooping folds of their drapery, the severe curve of their bowed necks. Visually, they form a descending triangle, a literal pyramid of grief melting into the lower right corner of the canvas.
The juxtaposition forces the viewer's brain to process the men as stable and the women as unstable, reinforcing the patriarchal logic of the Roman state David is depicting. And this geometric manipulation culminates in the painting's perspective system.
This is where it gets incredibly deterministic. In Renaissance perspective, the vanishing point is the mathematical center of the image where all parallel lines converge. It directs the viewer's eye with invisible gravity. Where does the vanishing point land in this massive composition?
The vanishing point converges with absolute precision on the hand of the father, clenching the hilts of the swords.
The entire architecture of the room, the paving stones on the floor, the masonry of the walls, all of it mathematically funnels the viewer's gaze directly into the weapons. The entire universe of the painting points to state violence.
Furthermore, David aligns the horizon line of the painting to intersect perfectly with the eyes of the foremost brother, the eyes of the father, and the crossguards of the swords.
Wait, really?
Yes, he creates a singular, inescapable horizontal axis connecting the militant intent of the youth, the commanding authority of the elder, and the physical instrument of death.
It is an inescapable visual trap. But there's one specific geometric detail, a hidden telegraph encoded in the posture of the brothers, that completely reframes how we view their unified front.
It is the most sophisticated subtlety in the entire work. At first glance, the three brothers appear identical in their resolve, offering the exact same salute, but look intimately at their extended arms.
Oh.
Only the brother, in the absolute foreground, the one closest to the viewer, possesses a perfectly straight, rigidly locked arm and wrist. The two brothers positioned behind him exhibit a slight, almost imperceptible break in their posture. Their elbows are slightly bent, their hands droop just a fraction of an inch.
Which means David is using the microscopic geometry of a locked joint to essentially spoil the ending of the story.
Precisely. Remember the legend. Only one brother survives the battle. By giving only the foremost brother the perfectly straight line, David is visually indicating that he alone possesses the unyielding, flawless structural integrity required to survive the meat grinder.
I think is brilliant.
The slight bends in the arms of the brothers behind him are structural flaws. They are already subtly marked for death by the geometry of the canvas.
That level of calculation is just staggering. And David illuminates this heavily structured environment with a lighting system that feels entirely unnatural. It doesn't look like sunlight diffusing into a Roman villa. It looks like a high-voltage theater spotlight cutting in from the left side of the frame.
It is a stark, highly directional light source, heavily indebted to the tenebrism popularized by Caravaggio. The light brutally highlights the tense musculature of the men and the bright fabrics, while plunging the background and the deep recesses of the room into impenetrable shadow.
Caravaggio used that intense chiaroscuro to manufacture psychological tension. The deep shadows make the figures feel like they are emerging from a void, isolating them from any surrounding context. It makes the ritual of the oath feel incredibly claustrophobic and absolute.
It strips away any environmental distraction, forcing the viewer to confront the moral weight of the scene in a vacuum.
Now, to a modern audience, this all sounds like standard, highly competent classical art. We are accustomed to seeing severe men in togas lit dramatically in museums.
Right.
But to comprehend why this specific combination of straight lines, austere architecture, and stoic morality caused an absolute frenzy in 1784, we really have to contextualize what it was replacing. David wasn't just introducing a new aesthetic, he was launching a targeted strike against the dominant visual culture of France.
To understand the explosive impact of the Oath of the Horatii, you have to immerse yourself in the art of the Ancien Regime, specifically the Rococo movement, which had a stranglehold on the French Academy and the aristocracy.
Given that you are likely familiar with the pastel, hedonistic overtones of Rococo, the Boucher paintings of cherubs, the Fragonard scenes of aristocrats kicking off their shoes on velvet swings, we don't need to define it at a basic level, but we do need to explore what Rococo represented politically to someone like David. It wasn't just a style, it was the visual manifestation of a decaying ruling class.
That is the crucial distinction. Rococo was the aesthetic of the court at Versailles, heavily championed by figures like Madame de Pompadour. It was characterized by dizzying asymmetry, feathery, highly visible brushstrokes, and a color palette dominated by pale pinks, mint greens, and soft golds.
Lots of fluff.
Tons of it. It prioritized sensuality, elite leisure, and decorative frivolity. To the emerging intellectual class of the Enlightenment, Rococo represented the moral bankruptcy and the insular narcissistic decay of the French aristocracy. It was art designed to distract, not to instruct.
It was an echo chamber of aristocratic privilege. So when David hauls a 14-foot canvas into this environment, a canvas painted in muted earthy browns and iron grays, depicting men preparing to bleed to death for civic duty, it must have felt like a physical assault on the sensibilities of the salon.
It was the definitive triumph of Neoclassicism.
Yeah.
And David was armed with the philosophical framework of Johann Joachim Winckelmann, the massively influential German art historian.
Winckelmann.
Yes. Winckelmann provided the intellectual artillery for the neoclassical movement. He famously argued that the art of classical antiquity achieved noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. He believed that mimicking the austerity of ancient Greek and Roman art could facilitate a moral and civic renewal in the modern world.
Winckelmann was essentially arguing that aesthetics dictate morality. If you look at frivolous, swirling art, you become a frivolous, corrupt society. If you look at austere, structured art, you become a disciplined, virtuous citizen.
Exactly. And Winckelmann championed the precision of tracing, the absolute supremacy of the drawn line over the application of color. And David adopted this dogma with terrifying zeal.
He really did.
In the Horatii, the crispness of the outline, the clarity of the form is paramount. Color is strictly secondary, used only to fill the geometric boundaries David had established.
Which leads to perhaps the most fascinating technical choice David made.
Yeah.
The implementation of what our sources call invisible brushstrokes.
This was a radical departure from the Rococo tradition. In a Rococo painting by Fragonard, the brushstroke is the star. It is expressive, rapid, and highly visible. It constantly reminds you of the virtuosity of the artist standing at the easel.
Right.
David systematically eradicated all evidence of his own hand. He applied the paint with such tightly controlled polished layers, using thin glazes to smooth the surface, that the canvas appears almost manufactured rather than painted.
As a creator, don't you want people to see your genius?
Yeah.
I mean, hiding the brushstrokes feels like a CGI artist in a modern movie. If they do their job perfectly, no one even knows they were there. It requires massive ego suppression.
It really does. But it was a deliberate philosophical stance. David didn't want the viewer to admire his brushwork. He wanted the viewer to be absorbed entirely by the ideological reality of the scene.
Wow.
He sought to create the illusion of unmediated truth. If you can see the brushstroke, you are aware it is a subjective interpretation. By rendering the surface glass smooth, David presents the Horatii not as a painting, but as an undeniable historical and moral fact. The gelida, or icy quality, noted by critics, is the deliberate chilling of emotion to elevate pure, rational statecraft.
So David perfects this icy, frictionless machine designed to proselytize absolute, unwavering loyalty to the state. Now we arrive at the supreme, almost unbelievable historical irony of the painting. Who bankrolled this masterpiece? Who commissioned this towering advertisement for unquestioning civic obedience?
The absolute monarch of France, King Louis XVI.
The very man who would be executed by the very people this painting came to inspire. I mean, how does David, a man who will eventually vote to sever the king's head, found himself working as the crown's premier propagandist?
It requires tracing David's ascent through the state-sponsored artistic pipeline. In 1774, David won the Prix de Rome, the most coveted prize in the European art world.
Okay.
Winning the prize meant the French crown funded a 5-year residency for David at the French Academy in Rome from 1775 to 1780.
So he is entirely a product of royal patronage. The king is literally paying for him to absorb the antiquities of Rome.
Exactly. The crown invested heavily in his ideological development, and the investment paid off. When David returned to Paris, his exhibitions garnered explosive acclaim. Figures like the philosopher Denis Diderot championed him.
He was a superstar.
His ascendancy was so absolute that King Louis VI granted him one of the rarest privileges available to a commoner: lodgings and a studio within the Louvre itself.
We have to remember that in the 1780s, the Louvre wasn't a public museum with ticket lines and tourists. It was a sprawling royal palace. The king was physically moving David into the royal orbit, signaling to the entire nation that David was the aesthetic voice of the crown.
And it is from this position of extreme royal favor that the king's administration, specifically the Count d'Angeville, the director of the king's buildings, officially commissions the Oath of the Horatii in 1784.
Right.
The political strategy behind the commission was straightforward. The monarchy was facing increasing criticism regarding its decadence and disconnect from the populace. The king wanted a monumental classical allegory that promoted civic virtue and, crucially, absolute loyalty to the state. And under absolute monarchy, loyalty to the state is synonymous with loyalty to the king.
The king wanted a 14-foot billboard saying, "Emulate the Horatii. Subordinate your personal desires, your family, your very life to the stability of the crown." He wanted the icy stoicism of the Horatii directed right at the throne of Versailles.
It was intended to be the ultimate royalist propaganda, but visual vocabulary is inherently unstable. The painting debuted in 1785. 4 years later, the Bastille is stormed, the French Revolution detonates.
And when the revolutionaries, the Jacobins, the Sans-Culottes, look at this painting, a painting paid for by Louis XVI, they don't see an argument for royal obedience. They strip the king out of the equation entirely.
they co-opt the visual matrix. To the revolutionaries, the Horatii wasn't about dying for a king. It was about the destruction of aristocratic privilege in service to the Republic.
Right.
The painting demanded the sacrifice of family lineages, which is the foundation of aristocracy, for the greater good of the nation. The rigid, unyielding men of steel became the visual archetype for the radical revolutionary citizen.
It's like paying a PR firm to make you a campaign ad, and they use it to start a mutiny against you. It is the ultimate ideological backfire. It is as if a modern authoritarian regime commissioned a massive, state-of-the-art surveillance network only for the populace to hack it and use it to broadcast the regime's own crimes.
That's a great analogy.
The tool built to subjugate them becomes the mechanism of their liberation. But the irony isn't just confined to the canvas. David himself doesn't just watch this happen from the sidelines.
Far from it. David undergoes a radical political metamorphosis. He deeply embeds himself in the revolutionary apparatus. He effectively becomes the minister of propaganda for the new republic.
Wow.
In 1789, as the revolution is beginning, he exhibits another royal commission. The lictors bring to Brutus the bodies of his sons.
Ah, yes. Another light, cheerful family drama.
Exactly. It depicts Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder of the Roman Republic. Brutus sits in stoic shadow while the decapitated bodies of his own sons are carried into his home. He had ordered their execution himself because they conspired to restore the monarchy.
The narrative escalation is terrifying. The Horatii killed his in-laws and his sister. Brutus executes his own children. The demand for ideological purity becomes increasingly lethal, and David paints this as a virtue.
David's immersion in this extreme Republican ideology bleeds from his canvases into his actual life. He joins the Radical Jacobin Club. He is elected as a deputy to the National Convention. And then the ultimate test of his own Horatian oath arrives. The convention holds the trial of citizen Louis Capet, formerly King Louis VI.
The man who funded David's education in Rome. The man who housed him in the Louvre. The man who commissioned the masterpiece that secured David's immortality.
When the roll is called, David stands in the assembly and votes for the execution of the king. He votes to send his patron to the guillotine.
How do historians and biographers even reconcile that level of betrayal? I mean, it borders on the sociopathic.
Yeah.
How does David justify turning on the king who housed him in the Louvre?
Mhm.
Is he just the ultimate opportunist, shedding his royalist skin to survive the revolutionary purge?
The historiography on David's motives is deeply divided here.
Okay.
Some view him as a ruthless pragmatist, a political chameleon who recognized that the power center had shifted and adjusted his allegiance to preserve his own neck and his artistic monopoly.
Survival via radicalization.
However, a more complex psychological interpretation suggests that David was a victim of his own aesthetic ideology. He'd spent his entire adult life marinating in the severe, unforgiving morality of the ancient Roman Republic. He had painted men who suppressed all personal loyalty for the state.
Right.
When the revolution erupted, he may have genuinely believed that he was living in a resurrected Rome. To vote to save the king out of personal gratitude would be the exact weakness he condemned in Camilla. He chose to be the Horatii brother. He amputated his personal gratitude to serve the abstract ideal of the Republic.
He became the monster he painted, and his instinct for survival, or his ideological flexibility, was unparalleled. Because after the Reign of Terror ends and his radical allies like Robespierre are executed, David is imprisoned in 1794. He comes within inches of the guillotine himself.
Very close.
But he survives. And a few years later, when a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte violently dismantled the Republic to crown himself emperor.
Napoleon installs Jacques-Louis David as the first painter to the emperor.
Unbelievable.
The man who painted the anthem of the Republic now paints Napoleon crossing the Alps and the monumental canvas of his imperial coronation. From absolute monarch to radical republic to military dictatorship, David provided the visual justification for them all.
Which makes his legacy, and the legacy of the Horatii, incredibly complex. Let's examine how the art world reacted to this painting when it was first unveiled, before all the blood was spilled. Because David knew how to manufacture a spectacle.
Oh, he was a master of artistic PR. He didn't debut the painting in Paris initially. He unveiled it in his own studio in Rome in 1785. The sources describe the exhibition as a cultural phenomenon that basically paralyzed the city.
Really?
It wasn't just artists who came, it was the entire strata of society. Cardinals, princes, international diplomats, and commoners lined up to view it.
It was an 18th century viral event. The logistics of creating that much buzz without mass media is staggering.
The demand was so intense that the Pope himself requested a private viewing. The consensus among the European intelligentsia was immediate. painting had been fundamentally altered. The prominent Italian portraitist Pompeo Bottoni visited the studio, viewed the Horatii, and famously turned to David, declaring, "You and I are painters. As for the rest, they can be thrown into the river."
That is the ultimate validation. Bottoni is looking at the rest of the European art establishment and declaring them obsolete with one sentence.
But the reception in Paris was far more hostile. When David shipped the canvas back for the official Paris Salon of 1785, the conservative establishment of the Royal Academy was terrified. They recognized the painting as an existential threat to the Rococo style they championed.
So the hanging committee engages in bureaucratic sabotage.
Precisely. They deliberately hung this 14-foot masterpiece in a terrible, poorly lit, obscure location within the gallery space, attempting to bury its impact.
But the public had already read the reviews from Rome. The hype was insurmountable.
The public outrage was so vociferous that the Academy officials were forced to physically move the massive canvas to a prominent central location. The public essentially vetoed the Academy.
And once it was visible, its influence radiated outward immediately.
It fundamentally rewired the next generation of painters. You see its direct DNA in the work of David's most famous pupil, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, particularly in his early classical subjects.
Okay.
There are also fascinating academic discussions about whether David was influenced by or parallel to the Swiss painter Henri Fuseli, who in 1779 painted the Oath on the Rutli. Fuseli's work also features figures locked in violent, unified postures within a compressed, shallow space. The zeitgeist was moving towards severe, oath-bound imagery.
And the imagery breached the boundaries of the canvas and entered the performing arts.
Yes, the symbiosis with theater continued. In 1800, Bernardo Porta, an Italian composer and a close associate of David's, premiered an opera in Paris called Los Horacios, based on the same Corneille play. The production featured a highly publicized tableau vivant, a moment where the actors froze on stage to exactly recreate the composition of David's painting.
A literal staging of the canvas.
Oh.
But the history of the Horatii is eternally tethered to violence, and that opera premiere was no exception.
In a grim historical footnote, the premiere of Porta's opera was attended by Napoleon Bonaparte, who was then first consul. As Napoleon's carriage approached the theater, a massive bomb hidden in a cart, the Machine Infernale, was detonated by royalist conspirators attempting to assassinate him.
Wow.
Napoleon survived and calmly watched the opera, but dozens of bystanders were killed. The ethos of state violence surrounding the Horatii seemed to manifest in reality.
Despite its monumental impact, the critical consensus on the Horatii has not remained universally glowing. As the 19th century progressed into the Romantic era, which valued individual passion and chaotic emotion, and later into the 20th century, the perception of David's hyper-rationality began to curdle.
Our sources highlight a potent critique from the mid-20th century. In his 1969 analysis, The Judgment of the 20th Century, the critic Osvaldo Svanacini mounts a severe attack on the painting. Svanacini argues that the work is a victim of its own obsessive perfection.
How so?
He describes it as so cold, so bound by protocol and mechanical centralization that it almost makes the viewer forget its technical brilliance.
I get it. I mean, Svanacini is evaluating the painting through the lens of a post-WWI world. When you have seen what highly centralized, mechanized, protocol-driven states do to human beings in the 20th century, David's celebration of men of steel marching in lockstep doesn't look like noble civic virtue anymore. It looks like the aesthetic blueprint for totalitarianism.
That is the crux of Svanacini's argument. He suggests that David's slavish devotion to the Greco-Roman ideal resulted in a canvas that is suffocating and devoid of genuine humanity. The invisible brush strokes and the flawless geometry create a vacuum that repels human empathy.
It's like listening to a technically perfect guitar solo with zero soul. But, you know, if we synthesize Svanacini's critique with our earlier analysis of the painting's narrative, perhaps Svanacini is misdiagnosing a feature as a bug. He criticizes the painting for being cold and mechanical. But maybe that coldness was exactly the point. The coldness is the horror of the oath. If the logic of patriotism demands that you slaughter your own sister for weeping, then patriotism is an inherently sociopathic mechanism.
You are suggesting that the brutal form perfectly mirrors the brutal function.
Exactly. David engineered a cold, centralized, mechanical composition because he was illustrating the chilling reality of a cold, centralized state demanding the blood of its citizens. The lack of humanity isn't an artistic failure, it is the terrifying thesis of the artwork. The coldness is the point.
It is a compelling counter-reading. It frames David not merely as a propagandist, but as an artist who captured the inherent terror of the state apparatus so accurately that it continues to disturb viewers centuries later.
Which brings us to the profound takeaways of this exploration. The Oath of the Horatii just completely defies categorization as a simple museum piece. It is a masterclass in psychological manipulation through geometry, using the straight line of a single arm to deterministic effect.
Truly.
It was a calculated, brutalist strike against the decadent frivolity of the Rococo era. It repackaged a traumatizing ancient myth into an Enlightenment blueprint for civic obedience. And it remains one of the most darkly comic political miscalculations in history, a king underwriting the visual language that would be used to justify his own execution.
It is a canvas that forces an irreconcilable confrontation. What do you value most, and what are you willing to systematically destroy to preserve it?
So as you move through the world, the next time you encounter a piece of media demanding your loyalty, whether it's a political broadcast, a corporate manifesto, or a piece of nationalistic cinema, look closely at the underlying geometry.
Look past the rhetoric.
Exactly. Who is positioned in the center, hoarding the light and holding the instruments of power? Who's being instructed to stand rigid, to abandon their empathy and become a man of steel? And crucially, look to the margins, into the deep shadows. Who is being pushed aside to weep? What generational trauma is being enforced on the children forced to watch? Art and propaganda are rarely just images. They are meticulously engineered arguments designed to bypass your logic and hijack your convictions.
A vital framework for navigating modern visual culture.
And we leave you with this final provocative contradiction to unravel. Jacques-Louis David navigated the collapse of an absolute monarchy, survived the blood-soaked purges of the Reign of Terror, and seamlessly transitioned into the inner circle of a military emperor. He lived in palaces and painted monumental truths for regimes that were actively slaughtering one another.
It's quite the resume.
It really is. Does that adaptability make David history's most brilliant, pragmatic survivor, capable of finding the universal classical truth within any political system? Or does it reveal him to be a chillingly hollow technician, an artist who cared infinitely more about the perfection of his invisible brushstrokes than the very real human lives being lost outside his studio window? Think about that the next time you walk through a museum.